You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Something I did not go over in the last video is one of the main reasons Ronald Reagan is effective. And it is something that I think academic people might really take for granted. And it's just simply this: Ronald Reagan was hilarious. Now, not hilarious as in, he would have this amazing George Carlin routine. I mean, he wouldn't, just tell this absolutely brilliant and incisive, hilarious joke. But Ronald Reagan was a master at using humor. And if you think about it, if you are going to turn the country in a different direction, you're going to be fairly controversial. And one of the ways that Reagan was able to get people to agree with him, even people who did not share his philosophy, is that he actually used humor very, very effectively in as a public speaker, speaking to voters, as well as negotiating with sometimes a very, very intransigent Congress. But of course, something that isn't really a laughing matter is the Cold War. The whole premise of, the end of all humanity, which was a potential result of the Cold War, is not really a laughing matter. And of course, Ronald Reagan presides over the United States at exactly the same time the Soviet Union begins to unravel. And so there's always this debate as to how much of a role does Reagan have in ending the Cold War, and why does the Cold War actually end? And I would say that it is a much more complicated story than most Americans realize. And we'll just go ahead and confront it head on, really. There's this sort of image of Ronald Reagan, the anti-communist cowboy, that in 1980, there's a new sheriff in town, and his name is Ronald Reagan. And if you remember that Ronald Reagan comes into office during a time period where you had this, during the Nixon administration, the Ford administration, détente was the watchword. Détente was the main, was the policy by which the U.S. and the Soviet Union agreed to de-escalate conflict. And détente goes out the window during the Carter administration, in part because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And Reagan himself is a fairly hardline anti-communist. And similarly, I think that we tend to believe that Reagan, the anti-communist, is the person who raises military spending, who takes a much more aggressive and hardline approach to the Soviet Union, and that forces the Soviet Union to escalate their defense spending at precisely the time that they can't afford it. That's kind of the, I would say, the popular conception. And, what this sort of fits into is that, the 1980s is the era of the action hero. This is the era of Luke Skywalker defeating the evil empire, of Arnold Schwarzenegger killing everybody in Terminator and Conan the Barbarian. I mean, this is an era where Americans are very, very obsessed with, with action, and Ronald Reagan, who better to lead the country than a former Western actor turned president? Who better to challenge and defeat the Soviet Union than that guy. And this is kind of the appeal of Ronald Reagan, I think, popularly, that we imagine that he is the president who stands up to communism. And by the way, that's not untrue. He certainly does, but it's a lot more complicated than that. Because if you're going to start, if you absolutely must credit somebody with ending communism, you also have to talk about a few other people. The first is Mikhail Gorbachev, who, without Mikhail Gorbachev, the really the entire premise, the entire thought of the Cold War ending becomes patently ridiculous. And you have to talk about Ronald Reagan's reluctant and thoroughly, I would say, very misunderstood vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush. And most importantly, though, the Cold War does not end, though, because of confrontation. There are really two Ronald Reagans. There is the Ronald Reagan who is an anti-communist, the Ronald Reagan who becomes president in 1980 and talks about confronting communism head on. But then there's the Ronald Reagan who is able to sit down with the leader of the Soviet Union and negotiate the end of the Cold War, because that process does start with Ronald Reagan. And I disagree with people who say that Ronald Reagan had absolutely nothing to do with the end of the Cold War, but I also disagree with people who say that it's because of his assertiveness, his confrontational approach that the Cold War ends. Ronald Reagan, believe it or not, helps end the Cold War because of his skills as an actor. Because at the end of the day, he and Gorbachev are able to sit down and see one another as human beings. And we've seen in other case situations, even somebody as smart as Nixon in the kitchen debate, that doesn't happen in other instances in the Cold War, where you have miscommunications between leaders of the Soviet Union and leaders of the United States. It's under Reagan where that starts to really change. But the first thing to remember is that when Ronald Reagan comes into power, he does view the Soviet Union as an evil empire. I mean, he actually has a speech that he gives to a sort of a convocation of different religious groups, Protestants, and again, that makes sense in itself because Reagan is elected because of the support of social conservatives, of religious conservatives. But I think that we can't overestimate Reagan's belief in the following. Ronald Reagan believes that détente and mutually assured destruction is evil. That mutually assured destruction is a policy that was patently accepted by Richard Nixon as the least bad option. That mutually assured destruction kept both the United States and the Soviet Union honest, because no side could directly confront one another in a war, because it would lead to not only the destruction of their respective countries, their respective alliance systems, but also, in part, the destruction of most of the human race. And to somebody like Reagan, who, let's say, has a much more ideological approach, a much more moralistic approach than maybe Richard Nixon, he sees this approach as unacceptable, as morally bankrupt. And so Reagan, in the aftermath of the invasion of Afghanistan, he characterizes the Soviet Union as an evil empire. And this approach actually puts him more on the same page with Carter, who sort of saw the Soviet Union in the same way, where Carter criticizes the Soviet Union based upon human rights grounds. And Reagan more or less echoes that same approach. And so what you start to see is the return of brinksmanship. I mean, we already talked about the fact that you have this massive increase in the military budget. And you're not just adding soldiers to the payroll. What you're also doing is you're creating incredibly sophisticated equipment, very, very modern equipment that combines breakthroughs in the latest in computer technology, among other things. And those of you who are interested, yes, Ronald Reagan does start to discuss the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars plan, where it's thought that the use of satellites equipped with laser beams placed in geosynchronous orbit would be able to intercept intercontinental ballistic missiles. And of course, the practical reality is that technology in itself is too impractical for it to really be a reality. I mean, it's still impractical today. I mean, I think the latest to my mind is that we have been able to mount a laser beam on the nose of a Boeing 747, and I guess you pay some poor sod to fly that plane constantly in the upper atmosphere, and you use that to intercept incoming missiles, and it's still very impractical. And I think that program was more or less terminated because it was just impractical entirely. But what it does do, I guess what you have to say, is that the Strategic Defense Initiative does threaten the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, the Soviet economy, as we'll talk about, does not have the capacity to sustain a massive arms race. And it certainly does not have, during this period of time, the technological sophistication to match something like that. And the concern for the Soviets is not that Ronald Reagan will, put satellites in orbit tomorrow. The concern is, what about 20 to 25 years from now? And while this is happening, you do have, once again, a return of the Cold War in the developing world, most specifically Nicaragua, where you have a left-wing Sandinista guerrilla movement that has overthrown the government, and a right-wing rebellion forms in opposition to the Sandinistas. And Ronald Reagan sees this right-wing group as as he puts it, I think he says that they are just like America's founding fathers. And so he sends weapons, aid, anything he can get by with. And Congress and most Americans are pretty unsupportive because, like any guerrilla movement, I mean, we've talked about it with the Viet Cong, the guerrilla movement has some fairly unpleasant sorts of people. And sometimes they are committing atrocities, both against government forces and against civilians. And so Congress issues or passes the Boland Amendment over Reagan's veto that restricts aid that Reagan can send to Nicaragua. Remember this in just a bit, because that's actually going to be quite important. The other thing that happens is that you have the overthrow of the Granadan government. Grenada is an island off the coast of Venezuela. The government there was overthrown by a leftist group that was supported by the Cuban government, and Ronald Reagan actually invades the island. Now, he does so officially, as he puts it, because there is a medical school in Grenada, basically like a third tier kind of medical school. Must be nice to go to medical school on a tropical island. Well, I guess most of the time it was nice, but the students got caught up in this sort of military standoff. There's debate as to whether or not they were actually detained or kidnapped. Interestingly, if you want to see a movie about this invasion, look at Clint Eastwood in the movie Heartbreak Ridge. It's just kind of a silly movie, but Ronald Reagan does go in and invade Grenada, and he overthrows the leftist government there and expels through force the Cuban advisors. The other thing that happens is that Libya is seen as a Soviet puppet state. And the Libyan forces that admittedly are armed and equipped by the Soviet Union are starting to take a very aggressive posture. There is actually an instance in the Mediterranean where Libyan fighter aircraft get too close to U.S. F-14 Tomcats, and the F-14s fire and shoot them down. And so Libya is seen as once again kind of a Soviet puppet state, which is really surprising because I don't see how you can look at Gaddafi and think of him as anybody's puppet. I mean, Gaddafi was very much his own thing. But in either case, this is kind of how things stood. That you had a hardline approach by Ronald Reagan towards communism and the Cold War. And that's really the case up until 1985, because in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power. For those of you who remember, dearly departed Premier Unibrow, Premier Brezhnev, of the former leader of the Soviet Union, he dies, I think, I'm trying to remember the year, the early 80s, and he is replaced first by a succession of old hardliners, I think mostly from the KGB, Yuri Andropov and Antonin Chernenko, excuse me, my Russian accent is failing me, Antonin Chernenko, but they die within just like a couple of years of each other. So the Soviet system itself is going through a lot of conflict. But Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power, and the first thing he notices is that the Soviet system is unraveling, that the Soviet Union is experiencing massive economic difficulties. Its agricultural system has basically unraveled, and you can sort of see evidence of this throughout the Cold War. But it was really starting to come to a head during the 1980s. Also, the Soviet Union was spending massive quantities of money on defense at exactly the time they could not afford it. Also, during the same time period, the Soviet industrial output was falling, while the industrial output of Japan, Germany, and to some extent the United States was on the rise. And it's very important to remember that Mikhail Gorbachev is not he is not a Western-style Democrat. He is not somebody who is an anti-communist. What he is he wants to take communism back to its more traditional Marxist-Leninist roots. He's something of an idealist. And yes, I guess at the end of the day, he is still a communist, but he's not somebody who thinks that the Soviet Union should be a military dictatorship, which it basically was under Stalin and Brezhnev. And so he implements two policies. It might be overstating it to say they're policies because they're more governing philosophies. The first is perestroika, which means economic restructuring. And what this means is that it is injecting a bit of the free market into the Soviet economic system, where you are decollectivizing parts of the Soviet economy. And the other, probably, I would say, much more significant component would be glasnost, which is openness. And what glasnost means is that whereas beforehand, Soviet history, discussion of, for example, Joseph Stalin, discussion of the KGB, discussion of any major political discussions. These were all things that were fairly heavily censored in the Soviet press. And what glasnost does, and this is it allows for a certain degree of political freedom. And Gorbachev believes that this will because you're allowing this political debate, this will ultimately make the Soviet system stronger. And if maybe the Soviet Union's allies can have open discussions, maybe that giving basically giving them that degree of freedom and openness, maybe they'll stay within the Soviet system. What actually happens, though, is as soon as glasnost starts to become state policy, what people instantly begin to do is they start discussing what happened under Stalin and Lenin. Basically what happened at the very beginning of the Soviet Union. And people start asking very, very awkward questions about, what it means to be uh, a member or a citizen of the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev also rejects the idea of intervening in internal political affairs of his Eastern European allies, the Warsaw Pact. And this is going to be incredibly important because if you remember, we talked sort of briefly about how in 1956 and in 1968, whenever Hungary or Czechoslovakia, respectively, start to distance themselves politically from the Soviet Union, well, by golly, Brezhnev Brezhnev sends in the tanks. And this actually becomes a doctrine, the Brezhnev doctrine, the doctrine that says that if Warsaw Pact nations distance themselves from the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union has the right and obligation to force them back into the Soviet Union sphere. And Gorbachev rejects that. He one of the first things he actually does when he comes into power is he says that the Soviet Union will not intervene directly in the internal political affairs of Eastern European nations. So Ronald Reagan, for the first part of his presidency, thinks that Gorbachev and the Soviet Union, that they're enemies. But it's really, believe it or not, another anti-communist who convinces him that Gorbachev is somebody who is reasonable, somebody who you can do business with, as she puts it. Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher encourages Reagan to negotiate with Gorbachev. And in 1986, there is the Reykjavik summit in Iceland. And this is one of those summits where you have to understand the summit itself is more important than anything concrete that comes out of it, because there isn't really any there isn't any agreement or treaty or understanding that comes out of the Reykjavik summit. I mean, there just isn't. But what really happens is that Reagan and Gorbachev are able to meet face to face. And what they realize is that they have far more in common than they ever thought possible. That at the end of the day, because you have to remember that leaders, like ordinary people, they're still subject to a lot of the same Cold War propaganda. And an entire generation of Americans, Reagan included, and an entire generation of citizens of the Soviet Union believed that the other nation wanted to wipe them out. That if you were an American, we've seen this with the Red Scare. There was this belief that the Russians, the Soviet Union, hates the American way of life, and the feeling was shared by the Soviet Union. What this does is it gives Reagan and Gorbachev a certain degree of insight in that there's this understanding that, the Soviet Union is not this boogeyman that wants to, nuke the United States. It's, there are reasonable people in control there. And so it's important for that, but it's also important because once you start the process of talking, once you build a relationship politically, it sometimes is difficult to stop. And so this starts the ball rolling because this is going to lead to even more summits in Moscow, summits in Washington, D.C. And once that door between Gorbachev and Washington is open, the two parties continue talking. What you also see at Reykjavik is the beginnings of what will become the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, or START 1, where we have SALT 1, SALT 2, you have START 1, and basically this is kind of similar. It's the negotiations to reduce the number of nukes that both sides possess. And Reagan doesn't sign it, but the negotiating process is begun and is really finished and signed in 1991 by Reagan's successor. It's also important to note, however, that as this is breaking out, and one of the complicating factors with Reagan's negotiations with the Soviet Union is you have the outbreak of the major scandal of Reagan's administration. Because if you remember, the Boland Amendment supposedly prohibits Reagan from shipping arms, from sending aid to the Contras in Nicaragua. It was an amendment that said, Reagan, don't under any circumstances do that. Well, Reagan does exactly that. He's still sending arms and supplies to the Contras. However, he's doing this under the radar, because what he's doing is that the Iranians are actually, the same Iranians who kept U.S. hostages for over a year. They're actually buying U.S. weapons at very, very high prices. And as what the United States does is that it sends the money that Iran sends under the radar to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, and also some of the excess money is also sent under the table to Israel to make sure that Iran's advantage from purchasing U.S. weapons isn't going to be a direct threat to Israel. So it's incredibly complicated. Most Americans were very, very frustrated by this. The backstory is that Reagan also does this because during this period of time, Iranian-backed rebels in Lebanon had U.S. hostages under their control, and the other sort of incentive here is that in exchange for selling Iran weapons, that Iran would also arrange for the release of these hostages, which I believe did indeed happen, and then the U.S. would send this money to Nicaragua. Now, there's debate as to how much Reagan knew about this, because the thing to understand about Reagan's presidency is that Reagan was an actor and he knew it. He didn't have a broad background in administration. And so the Reagan White House is what I would say fairly chaotic. There are some presidents where, I guess you would take, for example, maybe the Eisenhower model, where at the end of the day, Eisenhower was more or less in control of practically everything. Or to some extent, the FDR model, where the president really directs everything on a very, very direct level. But then we've also seen situations, the Grant administration, for example, the Harding administration, where the president allows a lot of freedom, of flexibility to, he gives a lot of freedom and flexibility to his cabinet leaders, his secretaries. And I think that in this case, Reagan kind of falls into the latter, because really he's not a detail guy. The two things he is predominantly concerned with is cutting the size of government and fighting communism. And for everything else, he has detail people, his cabinet secretaries. And this is one of the instances where I think this gets him into a lot of trouble. But in 1989, things really start to heat up in Eastern Europe. Remember that Gorbachev, to this day, believes that the Soviet Union is a good thing, as a positive force in the world, was a positive force in the world. And Gorbachev believes that communism needs to modernize, but not end. And what he's trying to do with Glasnost, with Perestroika, is he is trying to reform communism so that the Soviet Union can maintain its position in the world as the other superpower. But what happens in 1989 is, remember, Gorbachev renounces the Brezhnev doctrine, the doctrine that says that the Soviet Union will have the freedom and the capability to invade or intervene directly in Eastern European affairs if, for example, a nation like Hungary or Czechoslovakia reject communism. But in 1989, most of the Eastern European nations rise up. First Poland, and then you see Poland under the Solidarity movement in Poland, which overthrows communism, and Eastern Germany with the fall of Berlin Wall. You just have this sort of domino effect, an actual example of domino effect in Eastern Europe, where most of the Eastern European nations experience these fairly nonviolent revolutions. There is a violent overthrow of the government in Romania, but besides that, you have a series of nonviolent revolutions that lead to the fall of communism in most of the Warsaw Pact. And what this really does is this marks the end of the Cold War. And you could even make the argument the Cold War really ends maybe as early as 1986, because you start to get a sense for the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union don't view the other as the enemy. But with the loss of Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union loses so much of its political power and influence. But it's the end of the Cold War, not the end of the Soviet Union. That is not a goal. I mean, I think that's important to realize that Reagan comes around to the idea that the Soviet Union can still exist and can be reformed. But Reagan, at this point, leaves office. He served 2 terms. And his successor, George H.W. Bush, runs against Governor Michael Dukakis. And really, what I would say, in the election of 1988 is important for 2 reasons. One is that George H.W. Bush is a Rockefeller Republican. And the bizarre thing is, if you remember the old style Rockefeller Republicans, these are Northern Republicans from areas like New York, Massachusetts, so on. George Bush, remember George H.W. Bush, the father, he is a Rockefeller Republican from Connecticut, but because he lives in Texas and has a pretty close relationship with the oil industry, he very consciously adopts a sort of Southern accent and plays up his Texan roots, sort of signifying that the political base of the Republican Party is no longer in the North, but it's in fact in the South and in the Sun Belt. Dukakis, however, is basically a New Deal Democrat, to a certain extent. New Deal or New Left. He comes out of that old Roosevelt era New Deal coalition, where he tries to get the support of labor unions, of minorities, not so much Southerners, because Dukakis himself is a Northerner. But it really is the last election where these very old political coalitions, or these very old political philosophies, run against one another. And maybe because the times have changed so much that there really is no Rockefeller Republican coalition, and because of the fact that the New Deal coalition is dead, the election really turns on mudslinging. Very importantly, during the Republican convention in 1988, George Bush makes a pledge, read my lips, no new taxes, because there's concern that because of the deficit that's been accumulated in Reagan's presidency, that the budget is unsustainable as it is, which it certainly was. I mean, Reagan was spending a lot more money than the government was taking in, but Bush pledges, read my that he would not raise taxes, and he does that because the actual economic situation is improving during the 1980s, and you can make the argument that that's because of the Reagan tax cuts. There are economists who have cut down entire forests writing about what actually caused that sort of economic resurgence in the late 80s. But for the most part, he believes the economy is good, that it will continue to grow, and he believes that this will offset the need for tax increases. Now, the election of 1988 was really focused more on mudslinging. I mean, there wasn't the philosophical issues dividing the candidates were fairly menial. George H.W. Bush is going to be famous in that the domestic agenda of the nation does not interest him. He calls it, quote, the vision thing, unquote. He really is running as more of a foreign policy candidate. And the problem is that foreign policy does not, or being an expert on foreign policy, doesn't get you elected president in the United States. It just doesn't. And George H.W. Bush also has the additional disadvantage in that as the Republican Party has become more socially conservative, he's really not. He actually has to fend off challengers from the religious right. Pat Robertson, a major televangelist, actually runs against him in 1988 during the primaries and does fairly well. So what happens is that it really becomes a mudslinging campaign, and the political action committees of both sides really just sort of lambast and lampoon one another. Also, by the way, highlighting how political action committees start to really become significant during the late 80s as a way to advertise and get out their respective candidates' messages. But I think there's a perception that the mudslinging really reaches a new level in the 1988 election, where George Bush's PAC releases an advertisement criticizing Dukakis when he was governor of Massachusetts for giving a weekend furlough or weekend pass to Willie Horton, who had committed a murder and a rape while he was actually on this weekend furlough. Now, George Bush Sr. basically appeals to almost the Southern strategy all over again, Richard Nixon's Southern strategy. And, George Bush Sr., I mean, the guy's from Connecticut, he is not exactly a supporter of Jim Crow, but like Richard Nixon, who was also not a supporter of Jim Crow, he believes he needs the votes. And the way he accomplishes this is that instead of directly appealing to maybe some of the prejudices of maybe, shall we say, voters who are nostalgic and miss Jim Crow, Bush doesn't address the issue of racial segregation. But what he will do is that he'll talk about the issue of being tough on crime, of crime and punishment. And George Bush Sr. plays up the fact that he's tough on crime, which is very important because George Bush is and will be criticized quite often in the press for being perceived as a bit of a quote, wimp, unquote. And ultimately, these attacks become very, very effective because, again, it's like the Rorschach test. It's what some people see, especially some individuals who perhaps miss segregation, they see the language of being tough on crime as language that George Bush is will be tough on African Americans. What other more conventional conservatives see is that this is George Bush taking a stand against the excess of the counterculture, which had been sort of which had endured since the 60s. So it becomes something that all components of or all parts of the Republican Party sort of read into it what they want. And so, George Bush Sr. Does manage to win. Of course, Dukakis himself picks up some fairly important states. He picks up New York, he picks up Massachusetts, etc. But Bush more or less sweeps the election. Now, domestically, Bush is going to have trouble domestically because in 1988, probably the one central message of his domestic agenda is that he wouldn't raise taxes. And there were a lot of Republicans, actually, who were suspicious of Bush because he was not a Reaganite. He did not believe in Reagan's economic policies when Reagan was president. In fact, when Reagan and Bush were both running against each other in 1980, because remember, Bush was somebody else who was a contender for the Republican nomination. Bush characterizes Reaganomics as voodoo economics, his term. And so Bush in 1988, when he agrees not to raise taxes, is almost committing himself to following up Reagan's economic legacy. But the problem is that in 1990, there is a pretty big recession. And, recessions usually revolve around 3 to 6 year cycles. I mean, it just depends. But this is a pretty substantial recession. And Bush feels that he is forced to raise taxes because, again, he makes the pledge that he won't raise taxes based upon the notion that the economy is still going to be good. Well, the economy starts to fall apart in the late 1980s. And so Bush accordingly has to raise taxes. And of course, to be fair, this was sort of in some ways courageous. I mean, Bush had to change his mind. But the thing is, once you commit to do something on your domestic agenda, like not raise taxes, and then you raise them anyway, that becomes very hard for voters to appreciate. And accordingly, Bush is kind of seen domestically as clueless, as bumbling. And again, he does not see himself as a domestic agenda guy. He says he has problems with, quote, the vision thing, unquote. During the election of 1988, you have all of these hilarious pictures of Bush going around and marveling at modern day cash registers. Supposedly, there are pictures of him going into a McDonald's and waiting on somebody to give him a menu and wait on him. Bush is sort of seen as being woefully out of touch with the average voter. And I think sometimes we then lose track of we lose sight of of who he was before he went into the White House. And Bush was actually the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was a Cold War master spy. Not a very successful politician, but somebody with pretty broad foreign policy experience. Now, typically, if you look at CIA people, I mean, you would assume that they're going to be very hard on the Soviet Union, but it's actually going to be in the Bush administration where a lot of the agreements that in the Cold War unfold. In 1989, there is the Malta Conference, where this is actually occurring right as Eastern Europe starts breaking away from the Soviet system from the Warsaw Pact, starts overthrowing communist governments. And the Malta Conference was a very seminal moment because Gorbachev and Bush meet, and this is really the last time that the United States is afraid of an armed confrontation, because there is this fear that if the Soviet Union feels like it is breaking apart, it might feel the need to lash out. And this is the concern that some of Bush's advisors start expressing. And Bush puts those concerns to Gorbachev. He basically asked him, okay, so what's going to happen now? What kind of do you think that the Soviet Union might respond to this with aggression? And Gorbachev says that no, that Russia, or sorry, soon to be Russia, but the Soviet Union is going to pledge to normalize relations with the West. And in 1991, you actually have the signing and ratification of the START 1 treaty with Gorbachev. And this will actually cap the deployment of intercontinental ballistic missiles at no more than 6,000. Still more than enough. I mean, 6,000 nuclear weapons, but still it's seen as a positive step forward. You have a 35% reduction in ICBMs. And it has tremendous symbolic impact. But while this is going on, it's interesting to note that Iraq, who was a Cold War ally of the Soviet Union, who would also sometimes receive aid from the United States during the 80s, Iraq invades the nation of Kuwait and renames Kuwait a province of Iraq. Kuwait is like Iraq, an oil-rich Gulf state. Persian Gulf state. And the United States responds with creating a coalition to force Iraq to withdraw, because this kind of goes back to the Carter Doctrine, where the United States would proclaim that it would use force if necessary to protect its interest in the Middle East. Now, historically, if the United States wanted to use force somewhere, whether you're talking about Vietnam, Korea, etc., the Soviet Union would typically protest, or in some cases, it would arm the enemy of the United States. I mean, we did it with the Soviets. We armed, for example, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The Soviets armed the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. So, you know, it happened both ways. The interesting thing with Iraq is that when the United States forms a coalition to force Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait, the Soviet Union does not actually oppose. The Soviet Union doesn't really protest or try to seriously interfere with this coalition. And I think it's important to remember that, you know, nowadays when we look at the Gulf War, we kind of think it's like, you know, this massive achievement of technology, and some of the first. It's where the use of this advanced weapons technology developed during the 1980s, during the Reagan buildup, was really displayed for the first time, where you started to see the deployment of stealth technology, of smart missiles, you know, things like cruise missiles that function based upon GPS coordinates, etc. And the new thing for many Americans is that these images were being broadcast on CNN, where you would see these precision pinpoint weapons being delivered on targets. And the effect that this had is that, if you remember during the Vietnam War, where you had stories like My Lai, and you know, you saw very brutal fighting very close up on the nightly news, this seemed very, very clinical and very clean in comparison. And that's kind of our sort of perspective on it. I think it's fair to say that we sort of, after the 90s, developed this idea that war could be clean, that there didn't have to be collateral damage. And we sometimes forget what it was like on the other side, where this is the famed highway of death, where the Iraqi army retreated on its evacuation route from Kuwait. But it does have to be said that the use of this very sophisticated technology, especially this overwhelming aerial dominance, does reduce casualties that the coalition, and specifically the United States, takes during the Persian Gulf War. So the end game of the Persian Gulf War, well, after a period of very sustained bombing that occurs for weeks on end, on January 17th, 1991, the United States launches Operation Desert Storm, which is a very, very short 4-day ground war. And the Iraqi army, which has just been so demoralized by sustained bombing, just absolutely collapses. And I think what's important to note, by the way, is in terms of the Cold War, that the Iraqi army is an army that is equipped very similarly to the Soviet army, to the Red Army. That it has a similar doctrine, it has similar equipment. It is sort of like a Soviet army in miniature. Now, of course, their equipment is not as high quality per se. They're not getting, for example, the best exported material. But one of the things that the Russians and the Chinese are very worried about as a consequence of the defeat of the Iraqi army is that they very quickly realize that the same thing could have possibly happened to them in a conventional ground war. So it's not going to be it's not going to change the policy of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is already in the process of breaking up. It's sort of experiencing profound economic difficulties. But it is going to have a decisive impact, by the way, on China and what China and how China modernizes and equips its military. The U.S. suffers a total of 146 total deaths, 111 of those in combat. The estimates on casualties sustained by the Iraqi army varies, but it's anywhere from 20 to 35,000. But the media focuses more on this number, not so much this number. And so the lesson that Americans learn, kind of like the Spanish-American War in a way, is that war does not have to be excessively bloody, that war can be clean, war can be surgical, and that war doesn't really have to cost you anything. Also, very important to remember that the United States chooses not to advance onto Baghdad to depose Iraqi president, dictator Saddam Hussein. And the reason they do that, the reason they choose not to, because again, we're going to be seeing and talking more about this charming person in just a bit. The United States has a mandate, has the cooperation of most of the world, it has to be said, to remove Saddam Hussein from power. If it oversteps that mandate, if it decides that it's no longer just going to liberate Kuwait, it is going to invade Iraq and take responsibility for reforming and basically overthrowing Iraq's government, and that's something else entirely. Then the fact is that there's some discussion that what that would do is that it would inevitably cause a religious or sectarian war between Iraq's various communities, which, spoiler, is basically what happens in 2003. So shortly after the Gulf War, actually just a few months, Gorbachev, who wanted reform of the USSR, suffers because hardliners in the Soviet army and in the KGB launch a coup. They believe that Gorbachev has sold out the Soviet Union. They believe he is too soft. And Gorbachev is absolutely powerless to do anything about it. Gorbachev himself is actually on vacation when this happens. And so he is powerless. It's actually one of Gorbachev's old political nemesis, Boris Yeltsin, who defeats the coup. And whatever you can say about Boris Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin is very, very brave. He actually personally stands up to onrushing tanks that are bombarding Russia's White House, Russia's sort of presidential office, and Boris Yeltsin forces the tanks to literally stop, and the coup basically breaks up after this. Now, what happens though is that once Gorbachev once he actually gets back into Moscow, what he finds is that because Boris Yeltsin has taken this very strong and courageous stance, that Boris Yeltsin wields most of the political power in the Soviet Union. And because Boris Yeltsin is basically the leader, one of the things that he insists upon is that the Soviet Union be allowed to break up, be allowed to dissolve. And because if you remember, oh, I got the date wrong here. Because if you remember, the Soviet Union did not just consist of Russia. That was obviously the biggest single nation, but you're also dealing with, it's also Ukraine, it's also Belarus, it's also Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc. What happens is that Boris Yeltsin insists that the Soviet Union be allowed to dissolve, which is actually what Gorbachev is forced to sign on December 26, 1991. And so after this, you have the creation of the modern-day Russian Federation and really the formation of modern-day Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And it's very tragic, actually, because Gorbachev, the last thing he wanted to do is dissolve the Soviet Union. Everything he did was to save the Soviet system. And in actuality, what happens is that his actions force the Soviet Union ultimately to dissolve. And we perceive Gorbachev in the West as being this almost Churchillian figure, this person who courageously takes a stand based upon principle. And he does, and it fails. And so we forget the fact that it fails, but the people of Eastern Europe, more specifically in Russia, they remember the failure part. And what also happens, and this is going to be probably more important for just world history rather than U.S. history, but Russia enters into a very prolonged period of economic turmoil. That's actually much worse than it was in the Soviet Union. And in 1997, Russia enters into an economic slowdown that is actually worse than the U.S. Great Depression. It's something to keep in mind as we kind of look at the complexities in America's relationship with modern day Russia. That there is a very, very different perspective, and an understandable difference in perspective, given what happened during the fall of the Soviet Union. So that's the end of the Cold War. We will next sort of tackle the glorious 1990s all the way up to 2016.